Imagine being one of the most dominant players in NFL history, breaking records, earning Hall of Fame status, and still walking away from the game with one devastating statistic: 0 playoff appearances. While some players chase Super Bowl rings their entire careers, these legendary athletes couldn't even get a taste of January football. We're talking about Pro Bowlers, All-Pros, and even Hall of Famers who spent their entire careers watching the playoffs from their couches. These are the stories that'll shock you about the greatest players who never got their shot at postseason glory. Let's start with the most painful examples from the Motor City. Barry Sanders didn't just play for the Lions, he was the Lions for an entire decade. The man who many consider the greatest running back of all time spent 10 seasons making defenders look foolish, racking up over 15,000 rushing yards, and earning Pro Bowl selections every single year he played. But here's the kicker. In all those years of individual brilliance, Sanders won exactly one playoff game. One. The most heartbreaking part? Sanders retired at just 31 years old, walking away while still in his absolute prime because he couldn't stomach another season of organizational incompetence. He was just 1,557 yards away from breaking Walter Payton's all-time rushing record, but the Lions front office had let so many quality players slip away that Sanders knew they'd never be serious Super Bowl contenders. In his own words, there was simply nothing left to play for. But Sanders wasn't the only Lions legend trapped in this cycle of futility. Fast forward to the 2000s and 2010s, and you'll find Calvin Johnson suffering through the exact same nightmare. Megatron was a 6'5" freak of nature who redefined what it meant to be a wide receiver. He set the NFL single-season receiving record with 1,164 yards in 2012, made 6 straight Pro Bowls, and consistently put up video game numbers. Yet during his 9-year career, Johnson made the playoffs exactly twice, and the Lions lost both games. What makes Johnson's story even more brutal is that he begged the Lions to trade him before his retirement. He could see the writing on the wall, knew the organization was going nowhere, and wanted a chance to compete for a championship elsewhere. The Lions refused, essentially forcing one of the greatest receivers ever to choose between wasting away in Detroit or walking away from football entirely. Johnson chose his sanity and retired at 30, but not before the Lions demanded he pay back $1.6 million of his signing bonus as a final insult. If you think the Lions had it bad, consider the tragic tale of the 1965 Chicago Bears draft class. In one of the most loaded drafts in NFL history, the Bears selected 2 players who would become legends: Dick Butkus and Gale Sayers. These weren't just good players, they were generational talents who redefined their positions. Butkus was the most feared linebacker in football history, a middle linebacker who could destroy running backs and intimidate entire offenses with his presence. His hitting was so legendary that they named an award after him. Sayers, meanwhile, was pure electricity in human form. As a rookie, he scored 6 touchdowns in a single game, a record that still stands today. His combination of speed, vision, and elusiveness made him virtually untouchable when healthy. You'd think having 2 future Hall of Famers on the same team would guarantee playoff success, right? Wrong. Despite their individual brilliance, the Bears never made the postseason during either player's career. The closest they came was a 9-5 record in 1965, their rookie year, which wasn't enough to qualify for the playoffs in that era's more restrictive format. The cruelest irony? Both players' careers were cut tragically short. Sayers suffered devastating knee injuries that robbed him of his otherworldly speed, while Butkus was forced to retire due to knee problems at just 31. They became the youngest players ever inducted into the Hall of Fame, but they never got to showcase their talents when it mattered most. The Bears didn't make the playoffs again until 1977, years after both legends had hung up their cleats. Before Peyton and Eli Manning became household names, their father Archie was suffering through one of the most thankless quarterback careers in NFL history. Drafted 2nd overall by the New Orleans Saints in 1971, Manning walked into what can only be described as a football wasteland. The Saints were so bad during Manning's era that calling them dysfunctional would be generous. This was a franchise that didn't make the playoffs until their 21st season of existence, and Manning had the misfortune of playing during their absolute worst years. What made Manning's situation even more frustrating was that he actually had talent. He made 2 Pro Bowls despite playing for consistently terrible teams, proving he could perform at an elite level when given even minimal support. But the Saints front office was a revolving door of bad decisions, questionable draft picks, and organizational chaos that made sustained success impossible. Manning's sons would later achieve everything he couldn't. Peyton won 2 Super Bowls and is considered one of the greatest quarterbacks ever, while Eli captured 2 Super Bowl MVPs with the Giants. The Manning legacy is built on championship success, but the patriarch who started it all never even got a taste of playoff football. It's a reminder that sometimes being born into the wrong situation can define an entire career, no matter how talented you are. Joe Thomas spent 11 years doing the impossible, being an elite offensive lineman for the Cleveland Browns. From 2007 to 2017, Thomas anchored the Browns' offensive line through an endless parade of quarterbacks, coaches, and front office disasters. He made 10 consecutive Pro Bowls, earned 6 first-team All-Pro selections, and was widely regarded as one of the most technically sound tackles the league has ever seen. But none of that mattered because the Browns were a complete disaster. During Thomas's entire career, Cleveland had exactly 1 winning season, a 10-6 record in 2007 that somehow still wasn't enough to make the playoffs due to tiebreakers. Think about that. An All-Pro left tackle played for over a decade and experienced exactly 1 season above 500. Thomas watched the Browns cycle through 28 different starting quarterbacks during his tenure, making his job of protecting them nearly impossible. The most painful part of Thomas's story is the timing. He retired after the 2017 season due to injuries, and the Browns finally started showing signs of life just as he walked away. They drafted Baker Mayfield, started building a competitive roster, and eventually made the playoffs in 2020. Thomas spent his entire prime protecting practice squad quarterbacks, only to miss out on the Browns' resurgence by a matter of years. Gerald McCoy's story is equally heartbreaking, but with an even crueler twist. The defensive tackle spent 9 seasons as the heartbeat of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, earning 6 Pro Bowl selections and establishing himself as one of the premier interior pass rushers in the game. McCoy was everything you want in a franchise cornerstone. Talented, durable, and a leader in the locker room. But the Buccaneers were stuck in perpetual mediocrity during McCoy's tenure, never making the playoffs despite his consistent excellence. Then, in a move that perfectly encapsulates the cruel nature of professional sports, Tampa Bay cut McCoy before the 2019 season to save money. Just 1 year later, the Buccaneers signed Tom Brady, won the Super Bowl, and became champions. McCoy watched from his couch as his former team celebrated the championship he'd spent nearly a decade trying to help them achieve. Ryan Fitzpatrick's career reads like a love letter to perseverance and a tragedy about timing. The Harvard-educated quarterback spent 17 seasons bouncing between 9 different teams, always seeming to arrive just before things went wrong or leave just before they got better. Fitzpatrick wasn't just a journeyman backup, he was often genuinely good. He threw for over 34,000 yards and 223 touchdowns during his career, numbers that many starting quarterbacks never reach. His beard became iconic, his press conferences were legendary, and his gunslinger mentality made him a fan favorite wherever he played. But the playoffs remained forever out of reach. His closest call came in 2015 with the New York Jets, when he needed just 1 win in Week 17 to clinch a playoff spot. Instead, Fitzpatrick threw 3 interceptions in the 4th quarter, watching a season's worth of work crumble in the span of 15 minutes. It was the perfect encapsulation of his career. Flashes of brilliance overshadowed by devastating mistakes at the worst possible moments. Brandon Marshall's story is even more maddening because he had the talent to be a true difference maker. The 6'5" receiver was a matchup nightmare who consistently put up elite numbers despite bouncing between 7 different teams during his career. Marshall had 1,100-yard seasons with 4 different franchises, proving his production wasn't dependent on system or quarterback play. The timing of Marshall's career moves was absolutely brutal. He left the Chicago Bears just before they made a playoff push. The New York Jets imploded after he helped them get tantalizingly close to the postseason. Both the Seattle Seahawks and New Orleans Saints cut him mid-season before reaching the playoffs in 2018. Marshall was like a reverse good luck charm. Wherever he went, success seemed to follow after he left. Floyd Little's nickname was the franchise, because he single-handedly legitimized the Denver Broncos during their early years. Drafted 6th overall in 1967, Little became Denver's first true star and gave fans in the Mile High City something to cheer about during an otherwise bleak era. Little wasn't just good, he was elite. He led the NFL in rushing in 1971, made 5 Pro Bowls, and finished with over 6,000 rushing yards in an era when defenses were stacked against the run and passing was basically optional. His combination of speed, power, and vision made him one of the most complete backs of his generation. But the Broncos were a train wreck during Little's era. In his 9 seasons, Denver never had a winning record, never came close to the playoffs, and rarely even looked competitive. Little's best chance came in 1973 when the Broncos actually had a shot at the AFC West title. The cruel irony is that Little's leadership and production laid the foundation for Denver's future success. The Broncos would eventually become a powerhouse franchise, winning multiple Super Bowls and establishing themselves as one of the NFL's premier organizations. But Little never got to enjoy any of it. He retired just as the franchise was beginning to turn the corner, missing out on the success he'd helped build. These stories matter because they remind us that football is the ultimate team sport, where individual brilliance can be completely overshadowed by organizational incompetence. Barry Sanders could make 5 defenders miss in a phone booth, but he couldn't make the Lions front office competent. Calvin Johnson could catch passes in triple coverage, but he couldn't fix decades of poor management. Joe Thomas could protect quarterbacks who had no business starting in the NFL, but he couldn't block his way to a playoff berth. What makes these tales even more tragic is the what-if factor that haunts each story. What if Sanders had played for the Cowboys or 49ers instead of the Lions? What if Calvin Johnson had been drafted by the Patriots or Steelers? What if Archie Manning had landed with a competent organization? These players didn't just miss out on playoff success, they missed out on the chance to cement their legacies on football's biggest stage. The most painful realization is that many of these legends knew their situations were hopeless, but were trapped by contracts, loyalty, or simple bad timing. They watched lesser players win championships while they collected individual accolades that felt increasingly meaningless. Their Hall of Fame plaques tell stories of statistical dominance, but they can't capture the frustration of watching January football from the couch year after year. These aren't just stories about great players who never made the playoffs. They're cautionary tales about how the NFL's structure can waste generational talent. They're reminders that sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time can define an entire career, no matter how brilliant that career might be. And they're proof that individual excellence, while admirable, isn't always enough to overcome organizational failure. The haunting truth is that some of the greatest players in NFL history will forever be defined not by what they accomplished, but by what they never got the chance to achieve.